Hello there, wake up. It's Means Morning News. Just after 11 a.m. on the East Coast, I'm Sam Sachs, here to pump some news content into your brain like a New Jersey gas station attendant. Let's fill it up. The United States Senate had a chance to cut off over $8 billion in weapons transfers that are fueling a genocide in Gaza, and lawmakers rejected it by a lot. 2 resolutions of disapproval were introduced by Senator Bernie Sanders that would have begun a process to block a shipment of bombs and military equipment to Israel. Here was the independent senator speaking on the floor of the Senate ahead of the vote.
What we are talking about is a mass atrocity. And what makes it even worse, and why I am here today, and why I have introduced the resolutions that we will soon be voting on, is that we as Americans are deeply complicit in all that is happening in Gaza. This is not some terrible event. This is not an earthquake in Miramar. It's not something that we had nothing to do with. We are deeply complicit in all of this death and suffering.
Sadly, however, most senators are okay shouldering that complicity. The resolutions were voted down by wide margins. Over 80 senators voted no. Only 14 Democrats and Sanders himself supported the motions. As lawmakers were considering the resolutions, Israel bombed several schools, killing at least 27 people, mostly women and children. The Israeli military has displaced more than 250,000 people since it renewed its offensive last month. The Senate has now repeatedly voted to not block weapons transfers to Israel, even as U.S.-made bombs are used to commit mass human rights abuses. Most recently, fragments of a U.S.-made bomb were found at the site of an UNRWA clinic that was targeted in an Israeli airstrike that killed around 20 people. President Trump told reporters on Thursday that he's invited Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to the White House soon to, quote, try and solve the Gaza problem. Frightening. Trump's Department of Justice allowed a major financial merger to move ahead, claiming it won't harm competition or consumers. Capital One first proposed buying Discover in February 2024 in a $35 billion deal, but the acquisition was under scrutiny by the Justice Department all throughout last year. The merger is sort of unprecedented. Not only would it make Capital One the largest credit card issuer in the country, it would also mark a vertical integration in the bank and credit card services industry. By purchasing Discover, Capital One would be the first major credit card issuing bank to also own a vast payment system. Discover's main competitors, Visa, MasterCard, American Express, aren't banks. They're credit card companies. Discover's payment network is closed to just Discover's customers, whereas Visa and MasterCard have open payment networks and make deals with banks like Capital One to issue debit and credit cards through their payment networks. But by purchasing Discover, Capital One would no longer have to pay a fee to use a credit payment network. It would have its own. From there, it could choose to lock out competitors from using it, or charge higher fees for them to use it, or it could allow competitors access but use the data to earn a competitive edge. The antitrust probe was still active when Trump took over, and according to Bloomberg, the approval marks a change of direction at the department. Quote, DOJ antitrust officials had, in an interim version of the memo in January under the Biden administration, outlined some concerns that the deal could harm competition. But then a new administration came in, and with it a new chief of the DOJ's antitrust division, Gail Slater, former lobbyist and corporate lawyer. And surprise, surprise, the DOJ is no longer interested in trust busting. The Federal Reserve and the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency could still block the merger, but that's unlikely now, with the Justice Department finding no objection. Artificial intelligence companies and energy producers are getting the go-ahead to muck up public lands. Building off an initiative started under former President Biden, Trump's Department of Energy announced it identified 16 potential sites that are, quote, uniquely positioned for rapid data center construction, including in-place energy infrastructure with the ability to fast-track permitting for new energy generation, such as nuclear. Basically, what this means is allowing huge tech firms to build warehouses full of computers and methods to keep the computers cool, connected to on-site power plants. The AI industry is in the midst of an investment bubble as it makes all sorts of promises of what its technology can deliver, much of it unlikely to be borne out other than mass displacement of labor. Back in January, on his way out of office, Biden signed an executive order directing the Energy Department to lease public lands to AI companies to construct data centers. AI is incredibly energy intensive and threatens to offset whatever meager advances humanity makes in curbing warming by reducing demand for carbon energy. Under the Biden administration, the public land leases obligated companies to use clean energy to power the facilities. President Trump, however, is no longer requiring that. The Department of Energy cited an executive order issued by President Trump that actually repealed all guidelines and policies that, quote, imposed undue burden on the identification, development, or use of domestic energy resources, with particular attention to oil, natural gas, and coal. So yeah, they're going to power these things with fossil fuels. What's going to happen is we're going to develop the so-called technology of the future with the energy of the past that ensures we actually won't have a future. Okay, gang, it's time for Rich Dicks. Let's check out those nominees over at Blue Sky. Here's one for Saudi Prince Mohammed bin Salman, whose investment firm took control of gaming company SNK a few years ago, and the prince is now exerting his influence on it. Reports are that the follow-up to the fighting game Fatal Fury will feature characters close to bin Salman, including Cristiano Ronaldo, who plays for the football team Al Nassr, which is owned by the prince. Also in the game, the prince's favorite DJ, Salvatore Ganacci. Gamers are pissed off about this and see it as another example of the super rich ruining something with their own stupid preferences. Luke Savoy is also nominated. He's the CEO of Elbit Systems, an Israeli weapons manufacturer. Along with the US, he's providing a lot of the weapons used in the ongoing Gaza genocide. In other words, he's a genocide profiteer, the lowest of the low. And finally, a nomination here for every single health insurance CEO. Yeah, I can get on board with that. All strong nominations, thank you everyone, but ultimately, this week's Rich Dick is Robert Kennedy Jr. It's not his first time receiving the dishonors, but Kennedy is back in the barrel this week because he's currently overseeing an astonishing purge of the nation's top health scientists. 20,000 people across the Department of Health and Human Services are set to lose their jobs, including 1,200 at the National Institutes of Health, one of the leading medical research agencies in the world and the largest public funder of cancer research. Another 2,400 workers at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention are receiving pink slips, and the FDA is losing 3,500 employees. Altogether, this is a devastating attack on the institutions that conduct medical research, respond to public health threats, and ensure that the food and medicine we consume is safe. Among the individuals lost in this purge, the FDA's top vaccine official, Peter Marks, someone who Kennedy previously beefed with back in 2020 when Kennedy petitioned the agency to revoke its authorization for the COVID vaccine, and Marks denied the petition. Kennedy now in charge, Marks was forced to resign from his post. He said in a letter, quote, "It has become clear that truth and transparency are not desired by the secretary, but rather he wishes subservient confirmation of his misinformation and lies." The Atlantic ran down a list of other top doctors and scientists who've all been fired by RFK. Quote, "The head of the FDA's Office of New Drugs, the head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, the director of the CDC's National Center for HIV, Viral Hepatitis, STD, and TB Prevention, the head of the CDC's Center for Forecasting and Outbreak Analytics, the director of the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, the director of the NIH's Division of Microbiology and Infectious Diseases, the director of the National Institute of Nursing Research, and the director of the National Institute on Minority Health and Health Disparities." Also forced out by Kennedy, the leader of the FDA's bird flu response team, and the top scientists at the National Institutes of Health's Alzheimer's office. The New Republic obtained an internal email from a top official in that Alzheimer's office who called the firing a loss that will, quote, "have a profound impact on the work we do to understand and treat the disease." In addition to all the scientists purged, Kennedy has also gotten rid of communications and FOIA staff, essentially locking down information that the public is entitled to. Kennedy claimed the mass layoffs are merely part of a restructuring that was required by the so-called Department of Government Efficiency. However, this week, Kennedy admitted that as many as 20% of the people fired at HHS may have been a mistake. A mistake. Listen to this jackass.
There were a number of instances where studies that should have not have been cut were cut, and we've reinstated them. Personnel that should not have been cut were cut. We're reinstating them, and that was always the plan. Part of the DOGE, we talked about this from the beginning, is we're going to do 80% cuts, but 20% of those are going to have to be reinstalled because we'll make mistakes.
You'll make mistakes? Buddy, this isn't just a whoopsie. This is screwing with the lives of career civil servants and setting back public health initiatives years, if not decades. And for what? Because Elon Musk, the world's richest man, says you need to move fast and break shit? And also fire all those people who are regulating his brain chip company? These clowns talk about running government like a business, which is a bad idea, always, since the purpose of government is to provide for its citizenry, not turn a profit. But if someone at a business was tasked with doing mass layoffs and made a mistake with 20% of the people that were let go and they had to be reinstated, that person would be fired because they did a very bad job. Kennedy is a rich guy who can get all his medical needs taken care of. He can see a doctor whenever he wants and has access to top-of-the-line treatments. The stakes of all this are very low for him, but they're very high for the rest of us. Public Citizen reacted to Kennedy's admission with this statement, quote, "Protecting our children from lead poisoning is not the sort of thing you experiment with. And it's a good example of why the Musk-Kennedy-Trump approach of destroying things first and asking questions later will harm many Americans in ways that cannot ever be fixed. If Kennedy's claim is true, that it was always the plan to cut programs and then reinstate them, then the plan was either incredibly stupid or casually cruel. And of course, it could be stupid, cruel, and a lie all at the same time. Stupid, cruel, liar. I'd say that about sums up the U.S. Health Secretary, who is this week's Rich Dick. Okay, friends, the show ends today with a sunrise from New Jersey. It was sent in by Rook on their morning commute. Enjoy. Thank you, Rook. Keep those eyes on the road for me. Show's over. Thanks for watching, and thanks to the team behind the scenes. Please sign up for Means TV, subscribe to our YouTube and podcast channels, and follow us on social media. One day capitalism will fall. Until then, we'll be right here. See you next week.